Most people keep asking the same thing. What's the real difference between light, medium, and dark roast? Green Mountain Breakfast Blend is one of the easiest ways to understand this, because it clearly sits on the lighter side. And that's where most people start to notice something different without really knowing why. Because lighter roasting keeps more of the original bean characteristics, which means you get more brightness, more acidity, and a profile that feels a bit more alive compared to heavier coffees. And that's exactly why some people describe it as smoother and cleaner, while others feel like it's too light or not strong enough. And this is where the confusion usually starts, because people expect all coffee to deliver the same kind of experience, when in reality, roast level changes everything. And in this case, if you're used to darker coffees, something like this can feel weaker at first. Not because it's lower quality, but because it's less heavy and less bitter. And once you understand that difference, the reaction starts to make more sense. From a health perspective, this is also where things shift slightly, because lighter roasts tend to retain more of the original compounds from the bean, including some antioxidants, since they go through less intense roasting, but at the same time, they can feel more acidic, which for some people makes them harder to drink on an empty stomach. So, again, it's not about one being better than the other. It's about knowing what you're choosing and how it fits your routine. Trader Joe's Organic Coffee also falls into this lighter category, and this is where things start to become more practical. Because while it still keeps that brightness and slightly sharper profile, it tends to feel a bit more controlled compared to other lighter coffees, which makes it easier to integrate into a daily routine without feeling like too much of a shift. And this is exactly where most people feel more comfortable without realizing why, because it still carries some of that lighter profile, but without pushing too far into acidity. And that balance is what makes it a reliable option for people who want something cleaner without having to adjust too much or rethink their habits every time they drink it. And once you see these two side by side, the pattern becomes very clear. Lighter coffees bring more of the bean forward. They feel more open, sometimes more complex, but also less heavy. And that's why they work better for some routines and worse for others. Depending on what you're used to and how you like your coffee to feel day to day, Signature Coffee moves you into the middle. And this is where most people naturally settle without thinking about it, because it clearly sits in the medium range. And that's where you get the most balanced experience overall. Not too acidic, not too bitter, not too light, not too heavy, just stable and predictable. And this is where medium roast becomes more important than people think, because a lot of people assume medium means average, when in reality, it's usually the most controlled category. It keeps enough of the original bean characteristics to feel complete, while still being processed enough to remove extremes. And that's why it ends up being the safest option for daily use, especially if you don't want surprises. And this is also where consistency starts to matter more than anything else. Because when you're drinking coffee every day, what you really want is something that behaves the same way every time, something that doesn't fluctuate too much. And that's exactly what this category tends to deliver when it's done properly. And once you understand that, the decision becomes much simpler, because instead of reacting to taste alone, you start choosing based on how that coffee is going to behave in your routine, whether you want something lighter and more expressive, or something balanced and predictable. And the next ones are where things start to get heavier and more intense. Dunkin' Original Blend continues right from that middle category, and this is where things start to reinforce themselves in a more practical way. Because it's another medium roast that focuses on balance over intensity, it doesn't try to stand out too much. It doesn't push too far in either direction. And because of that, it becomes one of the easiest coffees to integrate into a daily routine without needing to think too much about what you're getting each time. And this is where a lot of people start to notice something they usually overlook, because what they often describe as basic coffee is actually designed to be stable. And that stability is not accidental. It comes from the way medium roasts are handled, because they keep enough of the original bean characteristics to feel complete, while also being processed enough to remove extremes, which is exactly what allows them to behave consistently across different batches. And that consistency becomes even more important when you consider how most people actually drink coffee, not as a one-time experience, but as something repeated every single day. And in that context, what matters is not how impressive a coffee feels in one cup, but how predictable it is over time. And that's exactly what this type of roast tends to deliver when it's done properly. If you've ever had a coffee that just seems to work every single day without you having to think about it, that's usually not random. It's because it sits in this middle range where everything is controlled enough to avoid extremes, but still present enough to feel complete. And this is also where people start to understand why medium roast is often the safest option, not because it's the most exciting, but because it's the most reliable. It gives you a balanced profile, avoids sharp acidity, avoids heavy bitterness, and creates something that fits into almost any routine without friction. Peet's Coffee moves you into the darker side, and this is where the shift becomes more noticeable, because darker roasting reduces acidity and increases bitterness, which makes the coffee feel stronger, heavier, and more direct. And that's exactly why some people are drawn to it, because it delivers a more intense profile that feels consistent and familiar from cup to cup. But this is also where another layer of confusion comes in, because a lot of people assume that stronger automatically means better or higher quality, when in reality, darker roasting is often used to simplify the flavor and create consistency, which means you lose some of the original characteristics of the bean in exchange for a more uniform and stable experience. And that trade-off is what most people don't realize they're making, because while darker coffee can feel more satisfying in terms of intensity, it also moves further away from complexity. And that's why it tends to feel more one-dimensional, compared to lighter or medium profiles that preserve more variation from the bean. From a practical perspective, though, this is where darker roasts can actually work better for certain routines, especially for people who are sensitive to acidity, because lower acidity makes the coffee feel smoother and easier to drink, particularly on an empty stomach. And that's why many people end up gravitating toward this category, without fully understanding why. And once you see how these two sit side by side, the pattern becomes even clearer. Medium roast gives you balance and predictability, while darker roast gives you intensity and simplicity. And understanding that difference is what allows you to make a decision based on what you actually want, instead of reacting to what feels stronger or more familiar. Folger's classic roast pushes even further into the darker side, and this is where the profile becomes more defined by the roasting itself than by the original bean. Because at this point, the process is focused on creating a stronger, heavier, and more direct experience, which is exactly why it feels so familiar to so many people, especially those who have been drinking the same style of coffee for years. And this is where the difference becomes very clear. Because compared to lighter and medium options, this type of coffee is less about variation and more about consistency. It reduces acidity even further, increases bitterness, and creates a profile that feels stable and predictable, which for many people is exactly what they are looking for. Something that delivers the same experience every single time without surprises. But this is also where the trade-offs become more visible, because as the roast gets darker, the coffee moves further away from the original characteristics of the bean, which means you lose some of the brightness, some of the nuance, and some of the variation that lighter roasts preserve more is. And that's why darker coffee can feel simpler or more one-dimensional when compared side by side. And from a health perspective, this is where small differences start to matter a bit more, because darker roasting tends to reduce some of the original compounds found in the bean, including certain antioxidants, while at the same time lowering acidity, which for some people makes it easier to drink. So again, it's not about one being better than the other. It's about understanding what you're choosing and how it fits into your routine. And this is exactly where most people get it wrong, because they assume that one roast level should be considered the best, when in reality, what matters is how each one behaves and what it delivers over time. BECAUSE. When you look at all of these side by side, the pattern becomes very clear. The lighter coffees bring more of the bean forward. They feel brighter, more open, sometimes more complex, but also a bit sharper, which is why they tend to work better for people who want something cleaner and more expressive, even if that comes with slightly more acidity. The medium roasts sit right in the middle, and this is where most people naturally settle, not because they think about it, but because it simply works. It balances both sides, avoids extremes, and delivers a consistent experience that fits easily into a daily routine without requiring constant adjustment. And the darker coffees move in the opposite direction. They reduce acidity, increase intensity, and create that heavier, more direct profile that feels strong and familiar. But at the same time, they simplify the experience and move further away from the original characteristics of the bean. And once you understand that, the decision becomes much simpler, because instead of guessing based on labels or marketing, you start choosing based on how that coffee is actually going to behave in your routine, whether you want something lighter, more expressive, something balanced and stable, or something darker and more intense. And that shift is what turns confusion into clarity. Because instead of trying to find the best coffee, you start finding what works best for you, something that fits your taste, your routine, and how your body responds to it over time. So instead of overcomplicating the process, it makes more sense to pay attention to what actually holds up, because once you recognize that pattern, everything becomes more predictable, and you'd stop wasting time trying to figure out what should work and start focusing on what actually does. And if there's a coffee brand you see often but still don't fully understand where it fits, leave it in the comments, because that's exactly how I decide what to break down next.